So this is number 24 in our discussion starters in 1 Corinthians. And we're in chapter 14. We're looking at the first 25 verses. And if you've got a little bit of time, I'd nudge you to stop the video at this point and just take a few moments to go over and read those verses. Paul packs a punch in those verses, especially if you're not used to having prophecy and tongues in your worship services in your congregation, because that's what he's talking about. In fact, it's Paul's wish, he outlines in verse 5, that we would all speak in tongues. But I would prefer you have prophecy. He who prophesies is greater than the one who speaks in tongues, unless he interprets so that the church may be edified. And so Paul has a high view of not only prophecy, but also tongues. In verse 11, he says, if then I don't grasp the meaning of what people are saying, I am a foreigner or speaker, and he is foreigner to me. And I think that's the way we feel in the church today about tongues. It's basically foreign to us, and we don't hardly make any space in a worship service for tongues or prophecy in our congregations today. In verses 22, 23, and 24, he says, tongues are a sign then not for believers, but for unbelievers. Prophecy, however, is for believers and not for unbelievers. And then he talks about the chaos in 23, and then he says in 24, but if an unbeliever or someone who does not understand comes in while everybody's prophesying, he'll be convinced by all that he is a sinner and will be judged by all, and the secrets of his heart will be laid bare. So he will fall down and worship God, exclaiming, God is really among you. In our current churches in North America, by and large, we've made very little room in worship for tongues or prophecy. And part of that is because of how we believe the Holy Spirit is working in our congregations. Some of us believe that's probably more done in the leadership rather than just anyone being moved in tongues this way. In Paul's time, though, everyone contributed something to worship. And some of that was prophecy. Some of that was tongues. Would like to make note of, as you read this passage, you'll come across the singular tongue and the plural tongues. Usually when Paul's talking about tongue, it would be that undecipherable tongue. In other words, it can't be interpreted because it's not really a language. Whereas when he's talking about tongues, he's talking about a known human language. In other words, it's much like Acts chapter 2, that when they came out of the upper room, they were speaking in tongues, but there were tongues that were understood by each of those nation groups, ethnic groups that were in Jerusalem at the time. And that's the miracle of the Pentecost, is as they came out of that upper room, they were speaking the gospel of Jesus Christ, praising God in known tongues. Can you imagine what it'd be like in your worship service on any given Sunday morning if all of a sudden the preacher started speaking in an unknown tongue, and the guy in the back from Zimbabwe would know and understand the gospel in his own language, but it's coming from a white guy up front? Can you imagine the power that would bring to a worship service? So what I want you to think about today is, could it be that we're entering a time where God might want to move boldly in our worship services? Maybe through tongues, possibly through prophecy. The question that we need to think about is, what would we do about that? That's something to think about.